First of all, let me say that sorry that there was a little confusion about getting into the room. I was also locked out, and then I was in a different room, and then that was locking all of you out.
Make it louder.
Anyway,
Here we are.
also we've had some losing power going on in my house. We've lost power briefly twice this morning. So if I go out, that's probably why. So this class is the Psalms in Hebrew and comparative translations. And this morning we are studying Psalm 9, which, wow, 9 Psalms. We've already gotten through, school. All right, so this morning we're studying Psalm 9. Let me begin with reading the Psalm out loud. Here we are. למנצח אלמות לבן מזמור לדוד. אודה אדוני בכל ליבי, אספרה כל נפלאותיך, אשמחה ואלצה בך, אזמרה שמך עליון. ושוב אויבי אחור יכשלו ויאבדו מפניך, כי עשית משפטי ודיני, ישבת לכיסא שופט צדק. גארת גויים, איבדת רשע, שמם מחית לעולם ועד. האויב תמו חרבות לנצח, וערים נטשת אבד זכרם המה. ואדוני לעולם ישב כונן למשפט כיס. והוא ישפוט תבל בצדק, ידין לאומים במישרים, ואדוני משגב לדח, משגב לעיתות בצרה. ויפתחו בך יודעי שמך, כי לא עזבת דורשך אדוני. זמרו לאדוני יושב ציון, הגידו ועמים עלילותיו, כי דורש דמים אותם זכר, לא שכח צעקת ענבים. חונני אדוני, ראה עוני משונאי, מרוממי משערי מוות. למען אספרה כל תהילתך, בשערי בת ציון אגילה בישועתך. טבעו גויים בשחת עשו, ברשת זו תמנו נלכדה רגלם. נודע אדוני משפט עשה, בפועל כפיו נוקש רשע, היגיון צלע. ישובו רשעים לשאולה, כל גויים שכחי אלוהים. כי לא לנצח ישכח אביון, תקוות עניים תאבד לעד. קומה אדוני אל יעוז אנוש, ישפטו גויים על פניך. שיטה אדוני מורה להם, ידעו גויים אנוש המה סלע. Well, first of all, obviously, this is the longest psalm that we've looked at so far, and I think in some ways the least cohesive. On the one hand, it's in some ways easier for a shorter poem to feel more cohesive than a longer poem, although I know many long poems that are very thematically cohesive, and this one is not. So we have a psalm which is kind of hard to understand, and also which seems to not be following its own internal pattern. So, for example, when I was studying this psalm to prepare, it was noted by several of the books that I prepare from that this psalm is a partial acrostic, and actually Psalm 9 and Psalm 10 both have aspects of the acrostic, and Psalm 10 seems to have some of the latter letters of the alphabet. So you have 4 lines at the beginning that all start with Aleph. Odeh, Asapra, Esmecha, Azamra, okay? And then you have a line that starts with bet, a line that starts with gimel, a line that starts with hey, and then 4 lines that start with vav, and then a line that starts with zayin, and then chet, and then tet, okay, and then yud. But in between, there are all of these other verses that don't fit the pattern. Now, we know that acrostics are a common form of psalm and of prayer in the Jewish tradition, because it gives us a sort of a sense of it gives us a sort of sense of like praising God from A to Z, you know, like the whole alphabet, the whole world, the whole all of existence. And one of our most famous and most oft repeated psalms, Psalm 145, the Ashrei, that is a psalm which has this form of 1 line for each letter of the alphabet. Oh, but this psalm doesn't perfectly match that. Some of the lines clearly, like there is a general order, but also it doesn't perfectly work. So that's one example of the way of one way in which this psalm feels like it's not as cohesive as it could be. But then also in terms of the themes and story of the psalm, it also isn't 100% cohesive. So when you were reading the psalm, what jumped out at you?
He didn't read it in English.
We can read it in English. All right. Would somebody like to read the translation from the Christian Standard Bible? That's the right-hand side of page 2.
Yeah, I have to see it.
I would.
Can you put it on the screen?
Yeah, please.
Much better.
Okay. All right. Did someone volunteer to read?
She did. Alba. Me.
Go ahead, Alba.
Okay, so it's the translation from Christian Standard Bible for the
Yes.
choir director according to Mut Laben, a psalm of David. I will thank the Lord with all my heart. I will declare all your wondrous works. I will rejoice and boast about you. I will sing about your name most high. When my enemies retreat, they stumble and perish before you. For you have upheld my just cause. You are seated on your throne as a righteous judge. You have rebuked the nations. You have destroyed the wicked. You have erased their name forever and ever. The enemy has come to eternal ruin. You have uprooted the cities, and the very memory of them has perished. But the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for judgment, and he judges the world with righteousness. He executes judgment on the nations with fairness. The Lord is a refuge for the persecuted, a refuge in times of trouble. Those who know your name trust in you because you have not abandoned those who see you, Lord. Sing to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Proclaim his deeds among the nations. Yeah. Oh, it keeps going. Right.
Keeps going.
For the one who seeks an accounting for bloodshed remembers them. He does not forget the cry of the oppressed. Be gracious to me, Lord. Consider my affliction at the hands of those who hate me. Lift me up from the gates of death, so that I may declare all your praises. I will rejoice in your salvation within the gates of daughter Zion. The nations have fallen into the pit they made. Their foot is caught in the net they have concealed. The Lord has made himself known. He has executed justice, snaring the wicked by the work of his hands. Higayon Selah. The wicked will return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God, for the needy will not always be forgotten. The hope of the oppressed will not perish forever. Rise up, Lord. Do not let mere humans prevail. Let the nations be judged in your presence. Put terror in them, Lord. Let the nations know they are only humans. Selah. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Would somebody else like to read the translation on the left-hand side of page 6 by Rabbi Richard Levy? Goes on to page 7.
I'll read.
All right, Mishka, go ahead.
To the conductor on Mut Laben, a Psalm of David. Adonai, I praise with all my heart. All your wonders will I take in tales account. Applause and shouts of joy I offer you. Anthems to your name I sing most high. Backwards turn my enemies. They fall over themselves. They perish from your presence. For you have rendered a judgment of justice for me. You have sat on the bench as a just judge, censuring the nations, destroying the wicked. You have blotted out their name from time and space. Enemies are ended, turned to eternal desolation. Their cities you uprooted, every trace of them is destroyed. Forever Adonai shall dwell on a throne you have prepared for judgment. For you judge the planet with justice. You try the nations with uprightness. For Adonai will be a fortress for the oppressed, a fortress in times of trouble. For those familiar with your name will trust in you, since you have not abandoned those who seek you, Adonai. Glad songs sing out to Adonai who dwells in Zion. Tell tales of God's deeds among the nations. For the one who attends to bloodshedders, keep these in mind. God has not forgotten the groaning of humble people. Have favor upon me, Adonai. See what I suffer from these who hate me, from those who hate me. You pull me from the portals of the deep of death, that of the sleep of death, that I might tell you praise stories at the portals of daughter Zion. How will I rejoice in the victory you have brought me? In the pit they have made, the nations sink down. In this net where they hid, their own foot is caught. Adonai is known, having done justice. Transgressors are trapped through the work of their hands. Oh, jaws of Sheol greet the backsliding transgressor, along with all peoples who forget there is God. Keep your faith. The needy will not be forgotten forever. The hope of the poor will not perish, not ever. Arise, Adonai, let not mere mortals prevail, let nations be judged by your presence. Bestow, Adonai, terror for them. Let peoples know mere mortals they are. Are they? Selah.
Right, so thoughts, reactions.
Well,
We've seen-
one of the first things that jumps out at me is that many of the phrases, statements that are sprinkled throughout this psalm appear in other psalms.
Great. So that is absolutely correct. They're not exactly, they're not all exactly the same, but but partial verses are very similar to other verses that we know from Psalms, especially from our Kabbalat Shabbat service, right? There are several phrases that it seems, hang on.
Turn on the light so we can see if the.
Have we lost our leader? I don't see him. There he is. There you is.
Lost our lead.
Sorry.
All right, this one.
I think one of the things that I'm seeing, as you had mentioned, is it jumps from here are we humans in victory. There are those nations that sink down, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. So there isn't a theme of all the evil, and then as the other Psalms have been, a joyous ending. It kind of ends in this, And I have to say, as I was reading, and of course, while you're reading, it's sometimes hard to keep track. Who are the mere mortals? Who
Everybody.
are they? And especially the last line, let peoples know mere mortals are they.
The wicked, right?
Presumably, which that's where I'm saying it comes up with not a positive, joyous ending.
No. And part of the reason why there isn't a joyous ending at the end of this psalm, I mean, not every psalm has a joyous ending, but also the Psalm 10 does not begin with a superscription, with like a line at the beginning, like to the conductor or a Psalm of David or whatever. Psalm 10 just begins, and that
Does it carry the same theme?
well, yeah, so right, a lot of scholars suggest that Psalms 9 and 10 are actually one psalm. That's sort of what I was saying about the acrostic. The first letters of the acrostic are all in this psalm, but the latter half of the alphabet is all in Psalm 10. So people think it's sort of a one psalm that was broken into two.
Maybe because it was too long?
I mean, it's possible. I think it, like, clearly this psalm was garbled somehow in the in the transmission of it. And part of that was it got split into two, too long. Well, there are psalms that are 50 verses long and psalms that are hundreds of verses long, and so I don't know that I'm not sure that in and of itself is the answer. Yeah, Gary.
One thing that stood out for me is that almost the entire psalm is about God being in charge of everything, with one exception. And the one exception is that the nations have fallen into a pit that they have made themselves. And the other thing is that this last line about humans being evil, I have not seen that elsewhere in the Jewish tradition. And I wonder if it does appear.
So that human beings are evil is there are some biblical precedents for it, especially at the beginning of the book of Genesis. But yeah, I mean, it's very stark here, very stark.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I cannot recall seeing this psalm in our liturgy. When is it recited, or when does one call? Other than, I suppose, at Chevra Kadisha.
Right. So we can look at that. This psalm, we never recite this psalm in its entirety, except if you're reading through the whole book of Psalms, as you pointed out, Murray. But we do use 3 verses from this psalm are quoted in our liturgy. So verse 9, V'hu yishpot tevel b'tzedek yadin le'umim b'meisharim, which is one of the verses that sounds very similar to another verse that we do recite all the time that's in the Kabbalat Shabbat service. This verse is it's in a slichot prayer, a penitential prayer for Erev Rosh Hashanah. That is for, the day before Rosh Hashanah. It's a special penitential prayer for Erev Rosh Hashanah. And the prayer is contained in an anthology of verses that are all about God's judgment. and God as a judge, and I've given you the other verses that are contained in that anthology. I didn't give you the full verses, just the citations, but the passage closes with Genesis chapter 18, which is the famous moment where Abraham asks that God behave with justice and save the people of Sodom. And so this verse from Psalms, right? And this psalm is all about wicked nations. This verse from Psalms is brought into that passage to sort of say, look, God, you should have mercy on us like you have mercy on other wicked nations. Shall not the judge of all the earth act justly? So that's one aspect, one place where this one verse from this psalm is used in our tradition. Then the verse 11, V'yiftechu v'cha yodei shemecha ki lazav l'dershech Adonai. That's the one that you'll probably recognize if you recognize, if you're familiar with our weekday prayer service. That's the verse from this psalm that we do most regularly. And I've shared two ways that we use it. It's alluded to in the weekday Amidah, the paragraph about the righteous that starts Al HaTzadikim Ve'al HaChasidim Ve'al Zignei Amcha Be'Yisrael, so which I've given the translation here. May your compassion, Adonai our God, flow to the righteous, the pious, the leaders of the people Israel, the remnant of the sages, the righteous converts, and us all. May those who trust in your name be truly rewarded, and may our share be among them, so that we never be shamed for our trusting in you. Baruch atah Adonai, promise and support of the righteous. So the phrase, all who trust in your name, let all those who, right here the translation says, let those who acknowledge your name, but the yiftechu betach means to have trust. So everybody, let all those who have trust in your name. That's understood by the Malbim and the Abu Draham. That's an allusion to this verse, that those who are the Yodei Shemecha, the ones who know your name, are the ones who have trust in you. So that's it's not a direct quote from the psalm, but it's understood to be alluding to this psalm. So when we pray in the Amidah for that God should not abandon the righteous, we are also putting that in the context, or alluding to the context of this psalm, which is about God's relationship with the wicked nations, and hoping for God's trust, for that our trust in God will be reciprocated. The full verse, V'yiftechu v'cha yodei shemecha ki lazav l'dershech Adonai, is also used in the Uval Etzion paragraph, which we say at the end of our weekday morning service, which, Jonah?
Rabbi, you suddenly muted yourself.
I think Jonah's in the room and
He muted.
he muted himself.
What are you doing?
Sorry, it's really
There
hard
you
to
are.
teach from home. But
You left off with Jonah.
yes, Jonah, my son, Jonah. Not Jonah having anything to do with the topic. The verse 11. So the Uval Etzion paragraph is another anthology of verses. So it turns out that if you're going to when you start looking at how psalms are used in our liturgy, they are, we do read some psalms in full. For example, during Psuke de Zimra, during our warm-up for prayer, and during Kabbalat Shabbat, during the special service for welcoming in the Shabbat, right? So there are some psalms that we read in full in our liturgy, but more often what we're doing is we're taking a verse from Psalms or part of a verse from Psalms, and we're re-incorporating it into a prayer. So there are a lot of anthologies of verses that are used as prayers that take psalms from all verses from all over Psalms and other parts of Tanakh and like reapportion them into a new psalm, basically. And so, right, so this verse is used in an anthology of verses that all are a meditation on the theme of trust in God. So, and the other, there's also a verse from Psalm 30, and also a verse from Jeremiah, and one from Isaiah, and another one from later in Isaiah. So the full Uvalatzion paragraph is all about praying for a future redemption, but the section that our verse comes into is the part of the prayer that is a meditation on the theme of trust in God. So that is how this verse is used. And then the last verse from this psalm that we use in our liturgy is Ki doresh damim otam zachar lo shachach tzakat anavim. For the avenger of blood remembers, God does not ignore the cry of the afflicted. And this is in the Av Harachamim paragraph in Shabbat Musaf. Oh, there's a joke. I don't know how funny this joke is, but I'm going to tell it anyway. There's a joke that there was a big conference of all the major religions to try to work toward greater tolerance and understanding of each other, and the Muslim leaders all come in conference, and they come to the interfaith gathering, and they say, we have decided that we will no longer have the doctrine of jihad as part of our religion. Right, we're going to excise the doctrine of jihad as a way of coming together with other nations, and the Christians, the Christian leaders go into a full discussions, and they're there in the Vatican, and all the Catholics and all the Protestants, and they're all coming together, and they've decided that they're going to declare the unity of God instead of the Trinity. They're going to get rid of the Trinity as a doctrine in Christian thought, as a way of coming together with other nations. And the Jewish leaders are in discussion, and the Muslims have already come back. They only deliberated for a week, and the Christians have already come back. They only deliberated for 2 weeks, and the Jews are deliberating. Months go by, and finally the Jewish leaders come and they say, we have decided that we will skip the second paragraph after the Musaf, before the Ashrei of Musaf. Okay, so the second Yikum Orkan.
Hysterical.
Yeah. So I think it's a self-mocking joke that Jews tell, to say, like, sometimes we get too serious about our liturgical emendations, but it's really, anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is we don't actually really do the Av HaRachamim paragraph in our community. So it's not necessarily something that you know. but the in the Musaf Amidah, in the Musaf, right, as we're putting the Torah away, there's an opportunity for like several prayers, and we sort of do them all in one, and we call it the blessings we seek, and it prays for our country and for Israel and for the nations and for all of those who are suffering and for our Jewish brethren and for our non-Jewish. It prays for everything, right? And it's a very nice prayer, but it does all of the above. But contained in our Siddur is each of those as its own prayer also. And the traditional approach is to do a special prayer for the community and then a second special prayer for the community. Anyway, and this prayer, which goes right before the Ashrei, is a prayer for asking for judgment against the martyrs. I don't love the joke because I actually believe that differences in religions are really important, and I don't think that I don't think that the ideal should be that every religion gets rid of its most important tenets of faith in order to get along with each other. Like, I think that that's exactly the wrong-headedness of sort of like that's what leads to dystopia instead of utopia. Like, I believe that we should respect each other's differences. I would be really, I think it would be really tragic if Christianity got rid of the doctrine of the Trinity, unless they want to in their own internal whatever. But like, that is to say, I don't think it's my job to tell the Christians what they should do about their religion, or the Muslims about jihad, right? Like, I have heard Muslim teachers speak about the important that jihad is really an internal struggle, and it's a super important part of what it means to be a Muslim, is to constantly be in this internal struggle towards submission. And I think that that's really important, right? Like, I'm not in favor of jihad in the context of like holy war, but I don't think that's what jihad really means in the context of Islam. Not that I'm an expert on Islam, or that I should tell Muslims what Islam means. But all of this to say, I don't love the joke, but it is for people who maybe grew up with a little engagement with the Orthodox Jews, especially, who like really once something is in, but we all do this sort of, once something is in the prayer book, we think that it's like given from God. Like, even though we all know that the prayer book is a human expression of what it means to be trying to connect to the divine, right? The prayer book, nobody says that the prayer book is divine, but sometimes when things get put in, then all of a sudden, like, how could you possibly, like the ritual committee meetings of how can we skip that, but anyway, all of this to say, also, right, you get so many Jews in a room, like the only thing they can decide on is maybe to skip the second Yom Kippur Khan. Yeah, okay. The point is we don't really do Av Harachamim in our shul except for once or twice a year, like on the Shabbat before Shavuot, and maybe on the Shabbat before Yom Kippur. It's an anthology of verses about God's avenging the blood of the innocent. And I've also given several of the verses that are included in that, and it's sometimes called a prayer for martyrs or a memorial prayer for martyrs. And it is, the first record of this prayer was in 1290. It's sort of related to the Jews who were killed by Christian crusaders as they were going to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslim infidels. They did a lot of slaughtering Jews on the way, and that's what this passage is sort of responding to. And anyway, in our community, we don't read it, but if you did read it, you would find verse 13 from our psalm right toward the end of it. Ki doresh damim otam zachar. Right, God remembers to avenge the blood of the righteous. All right, any thoughts or reactions, comments about the liturgical uses of this psalm? Yeah, Alba.
I thought, okay, first thought, I really like this thing about, I think it's more or less verse 16. The nation sank and the pit they made and the net that they hid their foot was caught. And I enjoy that because it sounds a lot like Purim, you know, you'll hang on a scaffold of your own making, and just like my father used to say that a lot, I'll see you hanged on your own scaffold. I find that interesting to see that here. It sounds like an alliteration to Purim. And then the other thing is that the punctuation is a complete nightmare. Everybody is working. It's either verse 2-3 or 3-4. There's a problem, 4-5, then go to 13-14. Everybody's having a problem with how to divide this up. You know, like verse, let's take it from the translation, James M. Hamilton Jr. from the Evangelical Bible Theology, page 6-7. Going from page 6 to 7, the verse 12 and 13 are connected, and then in some other places it's the 13-14 are connected or half connected. It's like everybody was really working hard with the punctuation. So I don't know who it was amongst us who said something about it was hard to follow along or it was hard to read. And that's a really good comment, because if the punctuation is all over the map, it's really hard to get a sense of what is this all about. Those are my two thoughts.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Like each one of the translations sort of understood the breakups of the verses differently. Very seldom, like in this psalm, all the translators are like, yeah, it doesn't make sense to end the sentences where the verses end, right? Like it does seem that the sentences go, you know, and when you're writing poetry, like that often is the case, right? The line breaks are not always the same as the periods or the punctuation. And so if you're going to think of the verses as they are in the Hebrew Bible as the line breaks, okay, it's not necessarily clear whether the period should go at the end of the line or should go in the middle of the next line, because it does seem like some of these verses are staggered in a weird way, right? And the acrostic aspect of it is also part of that, because clearly at least one of the authors of this poem wanted the beginnings of the lines to all start with the next Hebrew letter, but they weren't going to let that desire affect the sentence structure. So they sometimes like ended a verse that clearly should be continuing in the next verse, but they wanted that letter to be the first word of the line. So that's also part of it. No, it does make this an extraordinarily challenging psalm to punctuate. Absolutely correct. So, and one aspect of punctuation that I wrote about in our sheet, which I'd like to talk a little bit about, is this question of the Kari Ketiv. So, in our Torah, in our Masoretic Bible, in the Hebrew scriptures, every so often we have a word that there's a tradition to write it one way, but then to read it a different way. So in this psalm, we have two words that are written almost exactly the same, except that one of them has a vav and one of them has a yud, and you can tell from just from looking, the vav and the yud are written very, very similarly. The yud is just like a shorter vav, right? The vav is like a yud that continues to the bottom of the line, and the yud just sort of floats there at the top of the line. And so there's this word aniyim or anavim, okay? And because Hebrew is written without vowels, down here you can see, because Hebrew is written without vowels, these words are written like almost identically. It's just, is that letter extended to the bottom of the line or not? And one of them means poor and the other means humble. Okay, so both of these verses have a textual emendation called a ketiv, what is written, and a kri, what should be instead replaced. Now let me just give you one example. In the story of the rape of Dinah, there's a kri ketiv where it says the what is written is, and he raped her, but what we're supposed to read is and he had sex with her, right? So we sanitize it a little in our, like, the tradition is uncomfortable with reading the word, the harsher word, and so sanitizes it. Also in the curses that we read in the book of Deuteronomy, right before, the week before Rosh Hashanah, in Parshat Ki Tavo, those curses, right in the middle of them, around the point where it's talking about, where it talks about the women are going to eat their children and everything. There's also a part again with rape, where the enemies of Israel are going to rape the daughters of Israel, and we replace the word rape with just lie with. Okay, like, again, to sort of, it's so that it's less of a curse in what we say than in what is actually written. Anyway, so here this doesn't have to do with, anyway, this happens all over the place, where there's a tradition to write the word, but to read it differently from how we write it. So the Radak explains the ketiv, what is written in verse 13, is aniyim, poor, but the kri requires a vav for anavim, meaning meek or humble. And the Radak says the meanings are cognate, right? They mean actually the same thing, because the poor are generally the meek. And then in verse 13, in verse 13, in verse 19, it's exactly reversed. The ketiv is written anavim, which means meek or humble, but the kri is aniyim with a yud, meaning poor. And again, he says that the meaning means the same thing. And so I pointed out, as I was studying it, in verse 13, the population discussed, that is, are these the poor or are these the humble? That population discussed is just used, the other word in that same verse that refers to them is just otam, them. But in 19, there's a parallelism. It uses the word evyon, which means the poor. Okay, and so it makes sense to me that the word in that the word in that verse should be a synonym for Evion, meaning poor. But on the other hand, like the word Evion also could mean downtrodden or humble. So like Radak said, maybe these words are just extremely cognate. I did put down, so our translations render verse 13 as humble, downtrodden, afflicted, humble people, lowly or oppressed. None of them use the word meek, which is the word that Radak, the translator of Radak's commentary, uses that word, but the sense of meek is clearly there. And our translations render the word in verse 19 as poor or afflicted or lowly or oppressed. And then I pointed out that some of our translations use the same word to translate both, right? So we have 10 translations available to us in this class, and at least, and of them, half of them translate Aniim and Anavim exactly the same way, right? They use the word afflicted or the word poor or the word lowly to describe both of them. I actually think that is, like, if I were translating these and I saw the reversed Kri Ketiv, I would translate them the same way, because I think there's something really powerful about pointing out that these are almost exactly the same word. Mishka.
I'm looking at the Art Scroll translation, and they're using, for the pauper shall not be forgotten eternally, nor the hope of the afflicted forever perish. So two more.
Yes, afflicted is very common, is a very common translation of Anim. In verse, yeah, right. And pauper just means poor. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question with regard to the text? The Vav and the Yud in this particular commentary are somewhat of a different font, in that the upper part in the Vav and the Yud are both intensified.
I bolded them so that you would be able to tell.
Okay, so that's not the text. That's
No. I did that. Emphasis is my own. I bolded the affected letters so that it would be easier to point out.
Okay, that's good. It worked.
Yeah. Right. All right. So the one other thing that I wanted to say about this psalm is that a lot of the traditional Jewish commentators understand this psalm Mut Laben to be referring to Goliath. And I asked you in advance to read chapter 17 of 1 Samuel to sort of prepare yourself. If you didn't do that in advance, like, go back and read chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, because it's very interesting to read these psalms in their sort of traditionally understood context. Now, do I think that this psalm actually is a psalm that David recited after striking down Goliath? No, I don't. And I'm not even sure that Mut Laben, that it's obvious that refers to Goliath. In fact, the commentators are very, very split on that. Mut Laben literally means on the death of Laben, and Laben means the son, or of the son. So it could be like the death of the son. It's definitely not referring to the death of one of David's sons. David does lose a son, right? David does have children who die as young as babies, but it's not referring to David's son. It's Laban clearly is referring to an enemy of Israel, right? Like, in the context of the psalm, this is not a friend of David who dies. It's somebody else's, right? But also Mut Laben is so hard to understand that many of the translators just translated it as Mut Laben, right? Like, with italics, like they just transliterated those words instead of trying to give a translation of them. It's not at all clear what that means. But one of the traditional understandings is that is referring to to Goliath. So I brought a comment from Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb that I thought was really nice. Oh, okay. Oh, I did bring Radak, who tries to explain why people thought it was Goliath. That Laban is an a reference to Habenaim Ish. I don't think that's very clear at all, but whatever. Okay, so then Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb. Many of us are familiar with the basic plot of the David versus Goliath story. But if we reread it as it appears in 1 Samuel 17, we soon know two elements of the story that will prove vital for us to understand this psalm. For one thing, not only does a young, inexperienced lad armed with just a slingshot slay a giant warrior clad in armor, but he achieves a national victory for his people. After David defeats the giant and beheads him, the men of Israel and Judah rose up with a war cry and pursued the Philistines all the way to Gai, right? Okay, so they are this is like a huge national victory. Okay, but the more importantly, before he engages Goliath in combat, David debates him verbally and casts the debate in theological terms. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, whom you have blasphemed. So both the national nature of the victory and the blasphemy of the enemy are both important thematic elements in our psalm. So that's really interesting, right? Because I wouldn't necessarily have picked up on those two things as clear and obvious thematic elements of the psalm. But once you say, oh yes, this is what this psalm is doing, then reading back through it, you're like, oh yeah, that is over and over in the psalm. There's both of those aspects, the national nature of the victory and the approach of those who blaspheme God, the wicked, right? That I think that it is very clear that those are common themes in the psalm. And so it is very interesting to see how reading the psalm in the context of that story opens up our understanding of the psalm differently. So just to pull up the passage that we're talking about from 1 Samuel 17, when the Philistine caught sight of David, he scorned him, for he was but a boy, ruddy and handsome. And the Philistine called out to David, am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? The Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come here, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Right? And David replied to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the ranks of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I will kill you and cut off your head. I will give the carcasses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth. All the earth shall know that there is a God in Israel, and this whole assembly shall know that the Lord can give victory without sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and God will deliver you into our hands. And then the Philistine Goliath, he comes forward, and David kills him with a stone from his slingshot. And David has no sword, so he takes the Goliath sword from him and cuts his head off. And the Philistines run, and then the men of Israel and Judah rise up with a war cry, and they pursue the Philistines all the way to Gai and up to the gates of Ekron. And the Philistines fell mortally ruined along the road to Shearim, up to Gat and Ekron. All right, so that's I think there's a real insight in that aspect. All right, so we'll close out today by reading as we try to do, reading a spiritual insight or a spiritual application of this psalm from Rabbi Richard Levy, and he actually points out a verse that we didn't discuss that much, verse 17. Adonai is known having done justice. Transgressors are trapped through the work of their hands. Rabbi Richard Levy writes, so often we complain of the lack of justice in the world, failing to note the many times where justice is done, which is evidence of God's work. At other times, we overlook the contribution we ourselves could make to spreading justice, and hence spreading the knowledge of God. God is known by God's work, but we humans are sometimes trapped by what we have done, by a lie, for example, or by gossip that has come back to haunt us. Adonai is known having done justice. Transgressors are trapped through the work of their hands, right? So there's something powerful about this sense of knowledge of God that is connected to justice, like knowledge connected, like justice is about sort of transparency and freedom of knowledge, and then sometimes we get trapped by the lack of knowledge, or trapped by our own previous transgressions. So if you're using this psalm as a spiritual practice for yourself, one thing you might think about is, what are the ways that you can contribute to opening up avenues of justice instead of simply complaining about the lack of justice in the world? And in what ways are you blocked from your own seeking justice because of actions that you took in the past? And how can you overcome those obstacles? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Next week, we'll do chapter 10.
Everybody, what they're doing for fun today.
Yes.
Whoa.
Thank you.
Bye.